A full analysis of the ANC National Policy Conference. We are now joined in studio by Professor Suzanne Boyson from the Wits University School of Governance and Ronesh Doraj, a specialist researcher at the SABC. They both have been monitoring the conference. Well, thank you so much for joining us, for the both of you, Prof and Ronesh. The conference wrapped up today after 6 intense days of, the ANC within one space and with observers there. What did you observe being there for the 6 days that you were there, Prof?
Right, there are always conditionalities here, and of course the media and observers, researchers were not allowed into all sessions. Yes. So for much of the time we depended on an opening session, a closing session. Much of the time rumor or other journalists sharing little bits with me, or occasionally I get delegates. I've got quite a good few contacts there. Sometimes one gets a little bit of strategic information here and there, and it is the bigger picture then unfolding. But then they also started 2-3 days ago by now, and gradually briefed the media. Had as you just saw some on the screen as well, so very useful sessions, presentations, and then question and answers to the journalists. So those were our sources of information. And one starts drawing the lines between the dots, and that is really fascinating to see how the little bits come together. But very interesting, just a quick point on that, this policy conference delivered less information to us kind of people than it did usually. Usually there was, as there's been, and I've observed quite a few of these conferences, a very regular flow of information, regular briefings, staying on schedule. This time it was a much more haphazard, unpredictable. Some of the Commission's reports were not even presented to us. And so...
But why do you think this was the case?
Quick one, because I think there was so much controversy and there was much challenge inside. Okay, a very complex type of challenge, because sometimes it's purely on policy issues. Sometimes the policy issues get conflated or combined with campaign issues for campaigns for succession. And so it really becomes confused, and many delegates are very confused. Just one concrete example. Radical economic transformation, which is really, it is appropriately hijacked by one side, by one campaign, to try to differentiate a platform for campaigning for succession. But it largely here at this, and we'll talk about it later, I'm sure it did not quite work out here.
Now let's shift focus now, Ronesh, and look at some of the points that were made by the President in his wrapping up of the conference this afternoon. Now he spoke of land that could be targeted by government for expropriation, and land that is owned by government or so on. Which land exactly was he speaking of? Are you aware of the land that was, spoken of, or is it just random land all over the country?
I think what the President was trying to do, he was trying just to get, a sense within the actual conference delegates of how we should pursue the land question. Obviously, it's a very sensitive issue. We know all the debates, all the deliberations, the interrogation around land. We know other political parties are actually campaigning for the 2019 elections on the land issue. The most prominent example is the Economic Freedom Fighters, the EFF. Then we also have the former liberation black parties like the Pan-Africanist Congress, who have land as one of their core campaigning issues. But I think what the ANC President was referring to, a couple of speeches ago, he did mention, he took us back to the 1913 Land Act. So he says black people, black African people in this country were not dispossessed of land when apartheid came into being. That history goes back, decades and decades, even a couple of centuries, because remember, our colonial past did not only stop at 1994. Our colonial past goes back 300 years. Obviously, we're not talking about doing a land audit from, Jan van Riebeeck days, you know, from that time. But I think his reference point at this moment, where he was loosely speaking about land at that closing session, was the 1913 Land Act.
Now, Prof, how strong and how serious is the issue of amending the Constitution to allow for land expropriation without compensation? And is that even a possibility?
First place, it is. There are many various different proposals on the table here. I think the bottom line, and that the President reiterated in his speech this afternoon, in terms of the Constitution and in terms of law, if there is a necessity to change some of the laws, change those. But the bottom line, as several people also helped clarify afterwards, is the bottom line is things must be done faster. And that was one of the core messages that apparently did emerge from these commissions. So many of these instruments are there, but why has government been moving this slowly? And that is a question that's relevant to several policy areas. And there, for example, there were several references in these discussions and briefings to the land audit. Government has got a land audit, but that land audit doesn't yet say who owns what. It doesn't classify by racial category, for example. And so if one comes to restitution and accelerated land appropriation or restitution, whatever the case may be, then I haven't got enough information doing that. This morning in another briefing that Minister Lindiwe Sisulu held on her Commission on Social Transformation, she, for example, made a concrete point. Their commission wants the government to target municipal land, just not exclusively, but as a very solid starting point, because many municipalities are sitting on so much unused land, which can become available virtually immediately and without having to challenge laws or constitutional aspects. So it is actually, at the end of the day, it's a relatively safe and very moderate proposal. And as most of the other policy discussions here, resolutions were not quite put on the table, as we've seen in many previous policy conferences, several previous policy conferences. It is referred back to the branches to deliberate further. In previous instances, it was also referred back, but with firm guidelines. This time, many of these issues, especially controversial ones, are left much more open.
Now, Prof, the key word here seems to be proposals.
Exactly, yes.
When are we likely, yes, you mentioned the fact that there's a process where it has to be taken back to the branches by the people who were at the policy conference, and then from there, you know, there's probably going to be discussions and decisions then taken by the different branches as per the ANC structure. Now, when are we likely going to see the ANC moving from proposals to final decisions and taking whatever decisions that they make forward?
At the end of the year,
which is at the
elective conference, which is also the final policy decision-making conference. But it's interesting, perhaps there is going to be a renewed interest in policy at this conference. Our experience also from observing those year-end elective conferences are that the delegates are interested in elections.
The leadership, yes.
And then they go taking a cat nap on the lawn or going home after the leadership has been elected. But it's very interesting. Leadership elections, of course, could be more extend a longer process, also change process in the year, but it is for the end of the year. And you know, so much of the policy deliberations at this conference are about tweaking, urging ANC in government and saying, we shall ask, some of the more modest commissions saying, we shall ask government to do. Others just speak as if they are government. Those role confusions are often quite strong there.
Now, Prof, let's just go into the issue, and for you, Ranesh, as well, the issue of the ANC mulling over the nationalisation of the Reserve Bank, but also in the same breath saying that they want to keep the Reserve Bank independent.
Yes, yes.
How does that work?
Yeah, you know what, very, very confusing messages. You know, both Susan and I were at the briefing. You know, Godongwana had two briefings. He came, he briefed us, and he says he'll take questions soon after he goes to plenary. So he went to plenary, came back, then he fielded questions from reporters, and obviously we could sense as well Susan will vouch for me here, that he was a little unsure as well, you know, where that policy is, because the quote that he very nicely said, that the independence of the Reserve Bank should be guaranteed and it is sacrosanct. And he also said there is no resolution to tamper with the independence of the South African Reserve Bank. And then this whole issue of nationalization of the bank, and then we've seen the rand just fall, you know, the worst in 7 weeks or so. Yes. You know, then this other issue, he mentioned that the South African Reserve Bank has a total of 650 private owners of the bank, private owners of shares within the bank. So who those private shareholders are, no one knows. But I think it's a very interesting space to watch, and obviously this all goes back to what the public protector, she was the first one to actually, you know, set the proverbial cat among the pigeons, because she says, you know what, the Reserve Bank's mandate has to be widened, it has to be increased. It can't only be protecting the currency. So I think between now and December, just watch that space very, very closely.
Now, Prof, same sentiments?
Yes, very much. You know, different sentiments came through. At one stage in the briefing, it was also emphasized that shareholders have to be South African, not foreign shareholders. And then the message became blurred again. Did they really mean nationalization, or did they just mean it must be national citizens of South Africa who actually own it?
Do they know who the shareholders are?
I am not entirely sure. I think we should refer that back to the experts, that one.
Okay. You mentioned Ranesh, and we saw it, you know, 7 weeks of the rand doing very well against the US dollar, and after this, the briefing with the economic is it subcommittee? Yes, the rand then fell and you know, to about 1348, 1349, which is about just over 3% loss in a very short space of time. Now, should this be very concerning, also bearing in mind the fact that South Africa is in a technical recession?
Yes, the whole of South Africa and its currency shouldn't be going through what one of the high-level delegates helped me this afternoon, where he described the policy conference as really political education, ANC's political school. And so where he said many people from different orientations really come in here, and through the discussions get inducted into what is actually ANC policy. But then they said, but they have to put forward, maybe these are not their specific ideas, but different views come in and they have to put all of those views on the table, and it's almost a political education process then for people to come to terms. But I think in a public forum like this, where the briefings are a public forum, the end results, they should be more tangible, and there should be this more responsibility, one can call it, because there are announcements are being made that can rock the currency, and the currency is rocked. It's not just the rich and the white who suffer, it is poor people and more, and the whole financial system takes a knock when that happens. So there should be much more certainty and much more care, I think, before they come with very sensitive economic announcements.
Now, Ranesh, you want to add something to that?
I just want to add to what Professor Susan is saying. Obviously, you know, everyone's eyes was on this policy conference. The ANC is the governing party of South Africa. It has been the governing party since 1994. So I think there's also a level of political responsibility from politicians that actually needs to come from within the ANC. The last time we saw, a couple of weeks ago, the Sunday Times broke a story regarding a certain WhatsApp group and certain prominent ministers, you know, discussing about the rand and we'll pick it up when it falls. You know, those kind of irresponsible statements, I think, need to stop. And then the appointment of the new finance minister, then we had a cabinet reshuffle, and all kind of assertions were made in the public domain. I think the ANC at this policy conference, actually in the Secretary General's diagnostics report, actually picked on these issues as well, saying that, you know what, ANC members, NEC members, and obviously ANC government employees need to be absolutely responsible, because we are the leader of society. We are the governing party. So whatever we say becomes de facto policy, like we've seen. That's the reason why you'll see the rand take a plunge whenever somebody just blurts out something without, you know, without a second thought. So this whole issue of the rand, the Reserve Bank, like you said earlier on, we are technically in a recession as well. Then the other issue is there's the recent bank downgrades. Then compounding that, we've got the highest unemployment rate since 2003, 27.1%. Youth unemployment rate sitting at a staggering 74%. We cannot afford for any of these blunders or hiccups to actually surface with our economy being so vulnerable.
Now, Prof, let's move on to the issue of the integrity committee that delegates were calling for to be given more powers. Do we know what sort of powers they're talking about, one, and if there's any fresh approach to fulfilling the integrity committee's mandate?
Yes, that is very interesting. You know, there has been quite a bit of talk about the Integrity Committee and what their powers should be, and we've been assured that it will have more teeth. Beyond that, there's also been some articulation of how it might articulate with a disciplinary committee and how long action might take when this. We haven't got all the answers, to be quite frank. There's a good sentiment, but we have not been given the details. When you had that committee briefing, it was really a shopping list that was given. The committee looked at that and looked at that and looked at that. And subsequently, there was a bit of an explanation in one of the interviews people granted to SABC TV this morning that, yes, it will articulate with a disciplinary committee. But honestly, we do not know. We know there might also, would have to be people with status and esteem in the organization. And then we're frankly back to veterans. And hopefully the veterans in the next round of political contest won't be sort of marginalized because they've pronounced against the president. That is what's been happening now. And we know the Integrity Committee as it is now, there's been a dispute. Do they summons people to appear or do they invite them? And then people get invited and they don't even take it seriously. Maybe they pitch, maybe they don't pitch. And so it has been a serious need inside the ANC. And we hope in the next few months, or maybe they discover more detailed facts from their discussions when they compile their final policy conference reports. And it has to be tangible, it has to be effective, must have esteem and enforceable decision. People are asking the question, what if a person hasn't got a conviction behind his or her name, but can they be called in and told, you have been discrediting through your behavior, but damaging the image of the party? And so far we haven't had clear-cut answers to that, whether the ANC would be able to say a person, sorry, you can no longer be president, you can no longer be councillor, whatever the case may be.
Is that even a possibility? Do you think they would likely go that route where those powers are able to remove a leader from an executive position?
Now, there can be moral pressure, organizational pressure, if that person has got the interest of the organization at heart. That could happen. That person could see how a certain image is damaging a party. So it is possible, but you would need a sensitive person who wishes to cooperate. Otherwise, forget about it.
Now, Prof, this one is mainly directed for you. Ronesh, you'll come in just in a few minutes. But, the call by several delegates at the conference pushing for the party leaders to boycott COSATU future events. What does this say about the ANC and its alliance partners?
That's probably one of the great tragedies of this time in the existence of the ANC. That 10 years ago, that tripartite alliance was so strong. And what remains now is nothing. COSATU, in the first place, already split in, and the figure of the president, regulatory, is central to this. Much of the contention and fallout has been around the president, and COSATU had already split, and then the faction who was pro-president had also now fallen out, and SACP has become so critical on very valid grounds, and its ethics and morality and what the person does to politics in South Africa. Those are the issues that are contested on, and there is really nothing left of the alliance. But the president, in his closing speech, and Renesha also heard it today, even referred to our alliance partners as if nothing had happened. And that was so typical of the input from the top end of the organization into this conference. So we speak, we in the sense that they safe to speak about corruption. We, their words, must do something about it, as if this is not a phenomenon that is standing right in front of them. And that's probably been doing most damage to the ANC.
Now, speaking of, sorry, Ranesh, you want to say something there?
I just want to add, you know, like Susan was saying, if you look back 10 years, you know, 10 years back, we were at Polokwane, Limpopo. Yes. We had KwaZulu, the SACP, the alliance fully behind Jacob Zuma. Even as well in Zima Vabi, the former Secretary General of KwaZulu, saying that Zuma is unstoppable. He's a tsunami. He coined that word, tsunami. That was his quote. So we had those alliance partners behind Zuma. It's very, very different. The picture is absolutely different now. 10 years later, we're seeing the SACP, KwaZulu, calling for Zuma, Jacob Zuma, the man they supported 10 years ago, to actually step down. And just to touch on what Susan mentioned earlier as well, the ANC president, in his closing speech today, he says on the alliance, it is still very important, very relevant, but, there was a very big but, we need them to engage us constructively on the correct platforms.
Yes,
and I think that statement, that statement can tell you an awful lot.
Do you think they're likely to work out the issues that they have? Are they likely to sort out their issues before the elective conference in December?
Very unlikely, because there's a president that won't budge and two alliance partners that are taking very strong principled stance on the issue.
Now, let's sort of, you know, just play around with different scenarios here where, say they're not able to work out their issues before the elective conference, and then come post-elective conference and there's a new president in the organization. Do you think there's a possibility that they could work things out post?
Post-December 2017, possibly, because if our permutation, I'm talking about, you know, from a political perspective, say Cyril Ramaphosa becomes ANC president, and obviously the NEC, we get new people on that NEC. KwaZulu and SACP have always been behind the Deputy President, Cyril Ramaphosa. He has a trade union background as well. NUM, you know, he comes from there. So I think, yeah, KwaZulu and SACP could come back into the fold. But remember, the damage to KwaZulu has already been done. We had Zwelin Zima Vavi breakaway into SAFTU. We got NUMSA behind them as well. So the union is already fragmented. That union movement is already fragmented. And obviously with the SACP, there are ructions with the ANC in KZN, but you know, those ructions have surfaced in terms of political killings in Changa, for example, in KZN. So I think if and when the new president comes in December 2017, I think a lot of work still needs to be done building up to the 2019 general elections. And maybe Professor Boyson can just add a few lines here on the alliance, you know, how possibly.
Just, can I come in, just flipping the coin and say, Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma becomes president. We flip the coin, that sort of scenario, what are we likely to see?
Because of her close association with President Zuma, she is obviously his candidate. He has pronounced in favor of it. So I think all the baggage that is associated with it, or the bulk of the baggage associated with President Zuma, will be transferred to her when she comes in.
Now let's move focus to the issue of, you know, the ANC spoke very openly about scandals surrounding the Gupta family, state capture. From where you stand, what do you think the party, do you think the party has clear plans in dealing with complaints around this family and the issue of state capture?
Well, you know, if you look at the opening session, the opening plenary, the ANC president did touch on state capture, but I think he kind of feigned any knowledge. He knows exactly what state capture is, and I think that was terribly disingenuous of him, actually, because as the leader of the governing party, you know, some responsibility should have been shouldered, because a day later we saw the Secretary General's report, the diagnostics report, was released, was leaked to the media, and the Guptas were mentioned, state capture was mentioned. So in your face. Everything was exposed.
Prof?
Yeah, in some of the commissions it did come up. Yes, that's what we hear. Not that we can confirm. Absolutely, yes, it happened. So, and it was, people were referring to it, that was the elephant in the room. If they didn't call President Zuma himself the elephant of the room, or the corruption and the Guptas were the elephant in the room, some people were joking as to when are the Guptas holding their policy conference. Maybe the final answers come from there. But it was an uncertainty there because of the factionalism, and factionalism was also controlled here. The ANC's provincial secretaries had been meeting on several occasions the last few months in order to plan to keep things under control, at least in the plenaries. But then when the policy debates became the proxies for contestation at other levels, or just for mobilization against state corruption, etc., then things were not as controlled. But there was a hold back not to discuss it continuously and openly. And there the president was also the reason. The president speaks about all of the issues, but as if it is something distant there, as if he is, as Ranesh says, he would say something like, let's discuss capture and find out what it is about. But those were some of the issues that really, I think, held back the ANC at this conference from making rapid progress forward. Because one of the very important issues that they also raise in this diagnostics report is that they need to, and in strategy and tactics and in organizational renewal, is that they have to renew their bond with the people. Bit space on detail, but I believe the major way in which they can renew the bond, resuscitate former credibility that they had, or at least help make amends for lost credibility, would be to show in concrete steps that they're taking action against these little elephants in a room, corruption and capture. Certainly it's not just one person and one family that are the problems here, but these ones certainly are a huge part of the, problem. It will only be by directly addressing those that the ANC can start making amends and regain credibility, perhaps also with a view to future elections.
Now, Prof, let's move on to the issue of the International Criminal Court. The conference reaffirmed the decision of the ANC's 2012 conference, where they decided that they would withdraw from the ICC. Now, is this a widely shared stance within the organization, and what are the main reasons delegates are putting forward with regard for this withdrawal?
You know, I wasn't directly following that briefing. I don't know, Ranesh, you were more part in that one. But it is a widespread, the way I could see it, it was a widespread sentiment. And it's quite, delegates also are quite stirred up on quite a number of these national issues, nationalism issues, and that is one of the reasons that I could detect there.
And I think the thing that I picked up, like you cited the 2012 Mangaung resolutions, but I think the ICC issue only became an issue in 2015 at the ANC's National General Council. Obviously, preceding that in June, we know what happened at the AU summit that was held in Johannesburg. The Sudanese president, Omar al-Bashir, he left the country. Obviously, a court case was, a whole list of things were happening in between. So I'm not sure whether it actually goes back to Mangaung 2012, but also the ANC mentioned that withdrawing from the ICC actually started in 2012. But I think the reasons for that is, I think the ANC's argument is that, if we've got those mechanisms within the African Union, then why not use those mechanisms to sort out African problems? And one of the proposals or resolutions, I can't remember the document, I think it's the Peace and Stability. One of the resolutions very prominently mentioned is they want to give the Pan-African Parliament more legal teeth. They want to make it into a legislative body that can actually pass legislation. And as we all know, the Pan-African Parliament actually sits here in Midrand, in Johannesburg. So with the ANC taking that angle or taking that avenue, I think their main aim is we are Africans, we're South Africa, we're on the continent of Africa. Why do we have our leaders, take our leaders to be tried at The Hague in the Netherlands? You know, we are Africans, let's have African mechanisms to sort out our problems. Yeah.
Now, in closing, both Prof, to you, Prof, and to Ronesh, President Zuma really spoke very sort of extensively, but he spoke in detail about factionalism and referring back to the Polokwane conference where there was a lot of division. He spoke about the 60-40% split in terms of you know, the final leadership that was chosen, that was elected during that conference, and where opposition parties were formed and very good leaders were lost to the ANC organization or the ANC party. Now, do you think that you know, proposals of the introduction of a second deputy president into the party would work in unifying the ANC?
Yes, that was such an interesting part of that speech this afternoon, and of course people have been talking about that. We knew quite early on that there would be these type of proposals, but the interesting, totally new dimension was the president, the way in which he was denouncing factions, because he came to power through faction. Those factions were institutionalized in the ANC around 2007 Polokwane conference. They have not gone away, and so it was a bit rich of him to say at this stage, now that he's almost finishing his term, a term that has relied on a faction, that has ingrained one faction in institutions of state power, to the extent that it will be very difficult to move beyond a Zuma era, because so many of those people, and often not very qualified, are in those state institutions. And yes, I cannot see this proposal of the loser of the presidential nomination election then becoming automatically the second deputy president of the ANC. I think it depends on who wins. But interesting, quick point here. Many people that I spoke to there read this as a president reading that his candidate, Nkosazana Zuma, is probably at this stage not doing well in this contest, and therefore want to ensure that there remains an opening for her. But as others say
we have run out of time, unfortunately, very quickly.
No, absolutely. You know, I fully agree with Professor Susan Boyson. But for me, I think where the ANC needs to rectify, like the SG's report has diagnosed very correctly, is the problem lies with the branches. That's the basic unit of the ANC. Gatekeeping, factional battles, all of it starts from bottom up, from the branch level. Yeah.
To both of you, thank you so much for joining us.
It's our pleasure.
And that was political analyst Professor Susan Boyson from the Wits University School of Governance, and Ronesh Doraj, a specialist researcher at the SABC.